The night was cloaked in an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional drip of rainwater falling from the decayed gutters of the ghost town's outskirts. Daniel gripped his camera tightly, his breath visible in the cold air as he stared at the towering structure before him, the abandoned rail factory, or what the locals ominously called the Phantom Workshop. The rusted gates creaked as if resisting his intrusion, and as he stepped inside, a chill surged through his spine, almost like the place itself exhaled a warning. The factory loomed, its silhouette jagged and unnatural against the dark sky. Every window was a shattered eye, reflecting faint glimmers of moonlight. As Daniel walked deeper, his boots echoed in the vast emptiness, but something was wrong. The sound didn't fade into the distance. Instead, it seemed to follow him, as though someone else matched his pace. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the shadows, but found nothing but rows of rusting machinery, standing like sentinels frozen in time. The air was thick with the scent of oil and mildew, but beneath that was something metallic and sharper, the unmistakable tang of iron like blood. Daniel's pulse quickened as his light caught a smear of red on the floor, leading towards a partially open door. With every step closer, he felt the air grow heavier, pressing against his chest as though an unseen force wanted him to turn back. But his curiosity, or perhaps his hubris, propelled him forward. Inside the next room, the atmosphere shifted violently. The temperature plummeted, and the faintest sound of grinding metal filled the air, almost imperceptible but persistent. It was the sound of machines stirring, trying to awaken after years of dormancy. Daniel raised his flashlight and froze. There, in the corner, a figure stood hunched over an old workbench. He blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the outline of disturbed dust on the floor. His heart pounded as he whispered to himself, "It's just your imagination. Stay calm." But deep down, he knew something was watching him. He adjusted his camera to record, hoping that the lens would capture what his eyes might miss. Just then, a distant whistle pierced the silence, haunting and mournful, like the cry of a ghostly locomotive. The sound echoed through the building, growing louder and closer, but there were no tracks, no train, no explanation. Daniel turned toward the main hall, where the shadow of a massive locomotive suddenly appeared, cast against the far wall by an unseen light source. The shadow moved slowly, accompanied by the rhythmic clank of wheels on steel, as if the train were alive and crawling through the factory. He stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering, his breaths ragged. For a fleeting moment, the shadow stopped, and Daniel felt the unmistakable sensation of eyes locking onto him, unseen yet unyielding. The whistle blared again, deafening this time, shaking the very walls of the workshop. Daniel dropped to his knees, covering his ears, as a guttural, mechanical groan reverberated around him. And then it was gone, the sound, the shadow, the presence. The factory was silent once more, save for the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. But Daniel knew better. This was no abandoned building. Something lived here, something ancient, malevolent, and aware of him. As he stood up, trembling, the faintest whisper brushed against his ear, cold and deliberate. "You shouldn't have come." Daniel's hands shook as he replayed the footage on his camera, hoping to find an explanation for the shadow he had seen. The screen flickered, and for a moment he thought the device had failed, but then the faint silhouette of the locomotive appeared. It wasn't static, it moved, slow and deliberate, as though stalking him. A wave of nausea hit him, but before he could process it, his flashlight illuminated a workbench ahead. Something rested on it, a small, weathered object that seemed out of place in the desolation. It was an old pocket watch, its once polished surface now dull and tarnished. Yet, inexplicably, it was ticking. The rhythmic click-click-click of the second hand was eerily loud in the oppressive silence of the factory. Daniel picked it up, turning it over in his hands. His stomach dropped when he saw the initials engraved on the back, DL, his own initials. A flood of disjointed memories rushed to his mind, too blurred to make sense of. He staggered backward, clutching the watch as a sense of déjà vu enveloped him like a suffocating fog. A whisper broke the silence, faint but unmistakable. "Tick-tock, don't look away." Daniel's head snapped toward the sound, but no one was there. Instead, his eyes landed on something new, a journal half buried under a pile of rusted tools. Its cracked leather cover was embossed with the name Elijah Grayson. The name tugged at something buried deep within him, a recognition he couldn't place. As he opened the brittle pages, the air in the room seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping further with every word he read. The entries detailed Elijah's work at the factory and his growing paranoia. He spoke of strange accidents, machines activating on their own, workers disappearing, and a constant feeling of being watched. One passage stopped Daniel cold. It isn't just a train. It's alive. The Phoenix hungers for more than coal. It feeds on us, on our fears. I tried to stop it, but it won't let me leave. The words blurred before his eyes as a sharp, metallic scent filled his nostrils, stronger than before. Flipping through the pages, Daniel found a sketch that made his blood run cold. It was the same pocket watch now in his hands, drawn with excruciating detail. The caption beneath it read, "To my son, Daniel." His knees buckled, and the watch slipped from his grasp, hitting the floor with a hollow clang. His heart pounded in his chest as fragmented memories began to surface, fleeting images of him as a child, running through the factory, the sound of machinery roaring to life, and a man shouting his name. The journal's final entry was a scrawl of desperation. "I hear the whistle. It's coming for me. If you find this, run. Don't let it take you too." The page was smeared with what looked like blood, and the words seemed to tremble as if written in a hurry. Suddenly, the sound of grinding metal echoed through the room, accompanied by the distant but unmistakable hiss of steam. Daniel's eyes darted toward the shadows, which seemed to shift and crawl, forming shapes that defied logic. The sound grew louder, and with it came a low, guttural hum, almost like breathing. Daniel staggered to his feet, clutching the journal. The workbench he had been leaning on groaned as though straining under an invisible weight, and he realized with dawning horror that the shadows were converging toward him. He stumbled backward into the hallway, his footsteps echoing eerily in the vast emptiness. But just as he reached the threshold, the whisper returned, this time clearer and more insistent. "You can't escape what you've forgotten." The pocket watch, now lying abandoned on the floor, began to spin on its own, its ticking growing impossibly loud until it echoed like the relentless pounding of a heart. Daniel's vision blurred as the factory seemed to warp around him, the walls twisting and bending as if rejecting his presence. Somewhere deep within, the whistle of the Phoenix screamed to life, chilling and triumphant, as if welcoming its next victim. Daniel didn't need the journal to tell him what he already knew. This wasn't just a haunting. It was a reckoning. Daniel stumbled through the shadow-choked hallway, the journal clutched tightly to his chest, its brittle pages digging into his fingers. The air seemed heavier with every step, thick with an oppressive silence that was broken only by the faint, haunting whistle of the Phoenix in the distance. The sound didn't fade as he moved. It followed him, echoing through the factory like a predator stalking its prey. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the walls, which were now smeared with dark, rust-like stains that glistened unnervingly. He emerged into a cavernous chamber, the heart of the factory. At its center stood the control panel, an ancient, hulking piece of machinery covered in levers, dials, and blinking lights that had no right to be functioning. The room pulsed with an unnatural energy, and a low, mechanical hum filled the air. Above the panel, a massive gear hung precariously, dripping with an oily substance that smelled acrid and metallic. Daniel's breath hitched as his flashlight caught something horrifying. Deep scratches marred the walls, words carved with desperate force. "No escape. She chooses. The price is memory." As he approached the control panel, his stomach churned. A large red lever was marked with an ominous symbol, a gear encircling a screaming face. Beside it, a smaller lever glowed faintly, its handle stained dark as though touched by countless bloodied hands. Below the panel, a metal plaque bore the words, "*Restore the balance. Pay the toll." The meaning was unclear, but Daniel's instinct screamed at him to stay away. Yet, as he hesitated, the factory itself seemed to groan, the shadows at the edges of the room shifting like living things, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the voice returned, louder and closer than before. "You must choose." It was neither a whisper nor a shout, but something inhuman, a metallic resonance that reverberated deep in his chest. Daniel spun around, but the room was empty. Then, the control panel flickered to life, its lights flashing wildly. The smaller lever began to pull itself down, inch by inch, as if beckoning him. Panic surged through him as the journal in his hands began to heat, its cover branding his skin. He opened it, and new words had appeared, scrawled in jagged, desperate handwriting. "One lever takes your mind. The other takes your soul." Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He backed away from the panel, but the room seemed to close in on him. The walls warped, and the shadows coalesced into shapes, fleeting images of faces twisted in agony, their mouths frozen mid-scream. One face lingered longer than the rest, and recognition struck him like a blow. It was Elijah, the man from the journal. His eyes were wide with terror, his lips mouthing words Daniel couldn't hear. The whistle of the Phoenix blared, impossibly loud now, and the factory shook violently. Steam hissed from unseen vents, and the temperature dropped until Daniel's breath frosted in the air. He turned back to the panel, realizing he had no time. The levers demanded a decision, their sinister glow intensifying. The larger one seemed to pulse, emitting an almost magnetic pull, while the smaller one trembled as if resisting its purpose. Daniel's mind raced as the voice returned, this time clearer. Choose, or she will choose for you. He understood now. The factory wasn't just a place. It was alive, a malevolent force that demanded sacrifice to maintain its unnatural existence. The control panel was its heart, and the levers were the toll. His mind was a storm of fragmented memories and fears, but one thought cut through the chaos. What happens if I do nothing? The answer came swiftly, not in words but in the rising cacophony around him. The gears above the panel groaned and began to turn, grinding with a sound that made his teeth ache. The shadows surged forward, their movements erratic and hungry. They clawed at the edges of his vision, their whispers becoming screams. Daniel faced the levers, his hands trembling. The smaller one, he thought, might spare his mind but would strip away something else, his memories, his humanity. The larger one promised no mercy, its sinister glow a beacon of doom. He felt the weight of the factory's gaze pressing down on him, an entity beyond comprehension demanding its due. The whistle reached a deafening crescendo, and Daniel shouted, his voice raw with fear and defiance. He grabbed the smaller lever, feeling its cold, sticky surface beneath his hand. With a final, shuddering breath, he pulled it down. The room erupted in light and sound, a chaotic symphony of grinding metal, hissing steam, and guttural roars. As everything around him fractured into darkness, Daniel felt something being torn from him. Not pain, but a hollowing emptiness, as though a piece of his very essence had been ripped away. In the suffocating void, one final thought lingered. What did I lose? Darkness wrapped around Daniel like a living thing, pressing against his skin, suffocating his senses. The chamber where he stood felt different now, as though it had shifted in some imperceptible way. The air was colder, heavier, and carried a strange vibration, like the low hum of machinery that had long since died yet refused to rest. He clutched his flashlight tighter, its beam cutting feebly through the oppressive gloom. But the light didn't behave as it should. Shadows danced at its edges, twisting unnaturally, defying logic, almost alive. A faint whisper broke the silence, barely audible but sharp enough to make his skin crawl. It wasn't words at first, just a breathy, hissing sound that seemed to echo from all directions. His heart pounded as the whisper grew clearer, shaping itself into a chilling refrain. You've come too far. You can't turn back. The voice wasn't singular. It was layered, as though a chorus of unseen entities spoke in unison, their tones mocking and menacing. Daniel's flashlight flickered violently, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, half hidden by the machinery. Its outline was wrong, too tall, too thin, its limbs slightly bent as if it had been broken and hastily reassembled. He froze, his breath caught in his throat, but when the light stabilized, the figure was gone. Yet, he knew it hadn't truly disappeared. He could feel its presence lingering, watching him from the shadows. As he took a cautious step forward, the ground beneath him groaned, a deep, metallic sound that reverberated through the chamber. The machinery around him, rusted and lifeless moments ago, began to stir. Wheels turned slowly, gears ground against one another, and pipes hissed with bursts of steam. The noise wasn't deafening, but it carried a sense of menace, a warning that he wasn't alone, and he wasn't welcome. The whispers returned, louder this time, accompanied by faint footsteps that didn't belong to him. They echoed unnaturally, as though multiple pairs of feet were pacing in circles around him. The air grew colder, biting at his skin, and Daniel could see his breath forming in shallow gasps. A strange sensation crept over him, as though invisible hands were brushing against his arms, his neck, his back, testing his resolve, feeding on his fear. The journal in his pocket grew unnervingly warm, almost burning against his side. He pulled it out, its cover glowing faintly, as if reacting to the unnatural energy around him. The pages turned on their own, stopping at an entry he hadn't seen before. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "The shadows listen. Don't let them hear your name." Beneath it, an unfamiliar name was crossed out, over and over, as though the writer had been desperate to erase it. A sharp clang erupted behind him, and Daniel spun around, his flashlight jerking wildly. One of the machines had moved, a massive claw-like appendage now extended toward him, its tips dripping with some dark, viscous liquid. It twitched slightly, almost beckoning him closer. Daniel's instincts screamed for him to run, but his legs felt like lead, rooted in place by the sheer weight of terror. And then the whisper grew deafening, no longer a murmur but a roar that filled his ears. Daniel. His own name, stretched and distorted, reverberated through the chamber, spoken by dozens of voices, each one dripping with malice. The shadows around him swirled violently, coalescing into shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Their forms flickered and stretched, their faces featureless save for empty, hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. One of the shadowy figures stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with broken strings. It reached out an elongated hand, and Daniel felt a sharp pain shoot through his chest, as though invisible claws were digging into his very soul. He stumbled back, gasping for air, but the figure didn't advance. Instead, it stopped and tilted its head, as if studying him. Daniel tried to speak, to demand answers, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure raised a hand to its face, and suddenly, a mouth appeared, wide and grinning, filled with jagged, gleaming teeth. Its voice was a guttural growl, layered with a sinister mockery. "You don't remember, but we do." The machinery around him roared to life, the room trembling as though the factory itself was awakening. The shadows closed in, circling him like predators stalking their prey. Daniel backed into the control panel, his hands fumbling for anything that could protect him. The journal fell from his grasp, landing open on the floor. A new message had appeared, written in trembling letters that seemed to bleed. "You're already part of it. You can't leave. Choose wisely." The whispering voices overlapped, filling the room with chaos. The shadows surged forward, and for a brief, horrifying moment, Daniel felt himself pulled into their depths. It wasn't just darkness, it was cold, suffocating, and endless, as though he were being consumed by the void itself. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. Daniel was left gasping on the floor, the journal closed beside him, and the room eerily silent once more. The machinery had stilled, the shadows had vanished, but the oppressive weight of the factory lingered. He could feel it in his bones, in his mind, as though the place had marked him. Somewhere in the distance, the faint whistle of the phoenix called out, a chilling reminder that the worst was yet to come. The silence in the factory wasn't a relief. It was a trap. Daniel sat on the cold, greasy floor, his breath shallow and quick, his hands trembling as he clutched the fallen journal. The pages were still now, but he could feel something emanating from it, a faint, pulsating energy, almost like a heartbeat. The whistle of the phoenix had faded into the distance, but its echo lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the terror that stalked him. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, pressing against his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. He tried to stand, but his legs felt unsteady, as if the floor beneath him had turned to liquid. Then a sound pierced the oppressive quiet, a soft, melodic hum, distant but growing closer. It was familiar, achingly so, but twisted, off-key, and haunting. Daniel's mind reeled as fragmented memories surged forward. A faint tune, a lullaby his mother used to hum to him when he was a child. The melody swirled around him, pulling at his thoughts like invisible strings. The factory seemed to respond, its walls warping, shifting, becoming less solid and more alive. Shapes emerged from the darkness, fleeting figures that disappeared the moment he tried to focus on them. Whispers joined the lullaby, faint at first, then growing louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony. The words were indistinct, but their intent was clear. They were calling to him, taunting him, drawing him deeper into the factory's grasp. Daniel staggered to his feet, his flashlight flickering as he turned in circles, searching for the source of the sound. The shadows at the edges of the room stretched toward him, twisting into grotesque forms that danced just beyond the reach of the light. His heart raced as the whispers turned into voices, each one speaking his name, each one familiar, yet alien. One voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Do you remember now?" It was his mother's voice, but not as he remembered it. It was colder, hollow, devoid of the warmth he had clung to in his childhood. Daniel's head throbbed as flashes of his past bombarded him. Images of a little boy wandering the factory, a sharp cry in the distance, the sound of machinery roaring to life. The shadows began to shift again, converging into a single form in front of him. It was a woman, her features obscured by darkness, but her presence was unmistakable. She extended a hand toward him, her fingers impossibly long and thin, her movements slow and deliberate. "You've always belonged here," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Daniel backed away, but his feet refused to move far. The factory was changing, its walls stretching and shrinking, the machinery groaning as if alive. The woman stepped closer, and her face began to take shape, but it wasn't his mother's. It was a warped, twisted version, her eyes hollow and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "Do you fear me, Daniel?" she asked, her voice dripping with mockery. He couldn't answer. His throat tightened as the shadows around her began to writhe, taking on forms that mirrored his deepest fears. He saw himself as a child, lost and crying, surrounded by towering machines that groaned and hissed with malevolent intent. He saw his reflection in a broken mirror, his face distorted, his eyes empty. He saw the phoenix, its iron body glowing faintly with an unnatural light, its whistle a piercing scream that seemed to tear at his very soul. The figure leaned closer, her face mere inches from his. "You can't fight it," she whispered. "You can't run from it. But you can give in." Her words were like a weight pressing down on him, her presence suffocating. Daniel felt himself slipping, his grip on reality weakening as the shadows pulled at him. A sharp, metallic screech shattered the moment. The figure vanished, the shadows retreating as the sound of machinery roared to life once more. Daniel fell to his knees, gasping for air, his body trembling. The journal lay open before him, its pages blank except for one phrase, written in jagged, blood-red letters. "The Phoenix feeds on fear." His mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. The factory wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding on the terror of those who entered. The whispers, the visions, the twisted memories, they weren't just tricks. They were part of the Phoenix, a force that consumed fear and left nothing but emptiness in its wake. But the question remained, why him? Why had it drawn him here? The answer lay buried in the memories he had spent his life trying to forget, the memories the factory was forcing him to confront. And as he stared into the darkness, the faint hum of the lullaby began again, pulling him deeper into its grip. The temptation was undeniable. Fear was suffocating him, clouding his mind, eroding his will. The factory wanted him to give in, to surrender to the terror and become part of its endless cycle. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance remained. He wasn't ready to let the Phoenix win. Not yet. Daniel's breathing was shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears as the lullaby's haunting melody faded into a chilling silence. The factory seemed to hold its breath, the oppressive atmosphere thickening with an almost sentient anticipation. The shadows that once danced and writhed had stilled, now watching, waiting. Daniel felt the weight of countless unseen eyes pressing down on him, their presence unmistakable. Whatever force controlled this place wasn't hiding anymore. It was preparing. Ahead of him, the central chamber loomed, dominated by the dormant body of the Phoenix. The locomotive sat in eerie stillness, its blackened iron shell glistening faintly under the dim, flickering lights. Steam hissed softly from its rusted pipes, curling into the air like ghostly fingers. Its front face resembled a monstrous visage, with jagged, rusted metal forming the outline of a snarling mouth. The factory's heartbeat, the low, rhythmic thrum that had followed Daniel since he entered, was loudest here, radiating from the Phoenix itself. As Daniel stepped closer, the floor beneath him vibrated slightly, a mechanical growl rising from the massive train. The air grew colder, and with every step, the sensation of being drawn toward the Phoenix intensified, as if an invisible tether pulled him closer. His hands trembled as he raised his flashlight, its beam barely piercing the dense gloom. A guttural sound emerged, deep and resonant, like a beast stirring in its slumber. Suddenly, the journal in Daniel's hand began to vibrate violently. He dropped it, watching in horror as it flung itself open, its pages flipping furiously. When the motion stopped, one single line glared back at him, written in thick, jagged letters. "Face it or be consumed." The Phoenix roared to life. Its engine sputtered, then howled, sending a deafening blast of steam into the chamber. The lights flickered wildly, casting disjointed shadows that twisted and lunged across the walls. Daniel stumbled backward as the train's wheels began to grind against the rusted tracks, moving ever so slightly, as though testing its newfound freedom. The whistle screamed, not the mournful call he had heard before, but a blood-curdling shriek that reverberated through his very bones. The sound carried with it 1,000 cries of anguish, as though the voices of those it had claimed were bound to its monstrous core. Daniel dropped to his knees, clutching his ears, his vision blurring with tears as the noise threatened to split his mind apart. Then, through the cacophony, a figure emerged. It was the shadowy woman again, her form now more defined, her movements fluid and deliberate. She glided toward him, her eyes glowing faintly, her twisted grin stretched wider than before. "You've come so far," she purred, her voice a mix of honeyed malice and cold steel. "But the Phoenix doesn't forgive. It only takes." Daniel tried to speak, but his voice was lost in the roar of the train. The woman raised a hand, and the air around him seemed to constrict, pressing against his chest like an iron vice. "You've always belonged to it," she continued. "This place, your memories, they've been leading you here all along." Flashes of his childhood flooded his mind, vivid and disorienting. He saw himself as a boy, standing in this very chamber, holding the hand of a man whose face he couldn't fully remember. He heard his mother's voice calling out in desperation, the sound of grinding machinery, and the piercing whistle of the phoenix. And then nothing, a void where the memory should have been. The figure stepped closer, her voice softening into a whisper. "The truth is here, Daniel. It's in the fire, in the shadows, in the fear you refuse to face." She gestured toward the phoenix, its massive frame now shaking violently as though struggling against unseen chains. "All you have to do is embrace it." Daniel's body moved of its own accord, his legs carrying him toward the monstrous train. The heat radiating from it was suffocating, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning metal and oil. The closer he got, the louder the whispers became, a chorus of voices blending into a singular, insidious chant, "Join us. Feed it. Become whole." He reached out, his trembling hand inches away from the train's searing surface. But just as his fingers brushed the iron, a searing pain shot through his chest, stopping him in his tracks. He stumbled back, clutching at his heart as the shadows around him writhed violently. The woman hissed, her grin twisting into a snarl. "You're resisting," she growled, her voice losing its calm edge. "But you can't fight what you are." The journal, forgotten on the floor, erupted into flames. Its burning pages released a blinding light, momentarily dispelling the shadows. In that fleeting moment, Daniel saw the truth. The Phoenix wasn't just a machine. It was a vessel, a prison for countless souls, bound to it by fear and despair. And among them, he saw the faces of his parents, their eyes hollow, their mouths forming silent pleas. The woman's voice roared over the chaos. "You can't save them. You can only join them." But Daniel's mind was clear now. He understood the Phoenix's power. It thrived on fear, feeding on the terror of those who fell under its spell. If he gave in, he would be lost forever, another shadow bound to its infernal engine. With a surge of defiance, he reached for the control panel beside the train. His hand hovered over a lever marked with the same haunting symbol he had seen before, the gear encircling a screaming face. The factory trembled violently, the shadows closing in, the Phoenix screeching in fury. "Choose," the woman bellowed, her form dissolving into a writhing mass of darkness. With a scream of his own, Daniel yanked the lever. The factory exploded in light and sound, the Phoenix unleashing an unearthly roar that shook the very foundation of the building. And then silence. Daniel collapsed, the echoes of the whistle fading into the void. The factory was still, the shadows gone, the Phoenix dormant once more. But he knew the battle wasn't over. The truth had been revealed, but the Phoenix wasn't finished with him yet. The silence that followed was unnatural, suffocating, and alive. Daniel lay motionless on the floor, his breath shallow as the weight of the factory seemed to press down on him, heavier than ever. The Phoenix stood still, its monstrous frame looming in the dim light, but Daniel knew better than to believe it was over. The air was thick with tension, an electric charge that prickled his skin and sent chills down his spine. The factory was watching, waiting for his next move. As he rose to his feet, his legs unsteady, the shadows at the edges of the room began to stir again. They writhed and twisted, slowly converging into a shape that was grotesquely human, yet disturbingly alien. The figure was enormous, its limbs elongated, its head tilted unnaturally, as if mocking the frailty of human form. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, and from its mouth came a low, guttural sound. Not a growl, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the chamber. "Daniel," it spoke, its voice a chorus of countless others, layered and overlapping in a symphony of despair. "You cannot undo what you've started." He staggered backward, his flashlight flickering as the figure advanced, each step echoing like the toll of a bell. The Phoenix roared to life behind him, its whistle piercing the air, not as a sound, but as a presence that clawed at his mind. The control panel beside him sparked violently, its levers jerking erratically as if possessed by the factory itself. Daniel's gaze darted between the figure and the train, his heart pounding in his chest. The journal's words echoed in his mind. Face it, or be consumed. This was it, the heart of the factory's curse, the moment he had been dragged here to confront. The shadows thickened around him, their whispers growing louder, overlapping into a chaotic cacophony that drowned out his thoughts. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers impossibly long and sharp, and Daniel felt a crushing weight in his chest, as if it were trying to pull something from within him. Memories flooded his mind, memories he didn't know he had. A child lost in the factory's labyrinthine halls, a mother screaming his name, a father struggling against the relentless grind of machinery. The Phoenix had taken them, consumed them, and now it wanted him. "Give in," the figure hissed, its voice both seductive and threatening. "You've already seen the truth. You belong to us." But Daniel refused to surrender. Clutching the journal in one hand, he stumbled toward the control panel, his fingers searching for something, anything, that could end this nightmare. His eyes landed on a switch marked with a symbol he hadn't seen before, an intricate design of gears surrounding an open flame. It was faintly illuminated, pulsing in time with the factory's thrumming heartbeat. The figure screamed, a sound that tore through the room like shattering glass. "You dare defy the Phoenix?" It roared, its form growing larger, its shadow stretching impossibly wide to engulf the chamber. The Phoenix itself seemed to react, its engine roaring and spewing steam as the train's wheels began to turn. The ground beneath Daniel trembled, and he struggled to keep his footing. "You're nothing but fuel," the figure snarled, its hollow eyes locking onto him. "Your fear feeds us, your pain sustains us. You cannot escape." Summoning every ounce of courage, Daniel flipped the switch. The factory erupted into chaos. The lights overhead shattered one by one, plunging the room into strobing darkness as the Phoenix screamed in fury. The machinery roared to life, gears grinding, metal shrieking, and steam hissing from every corner. The shadows lashed out violently, clawing at him, but he held his ground, his hands gripping the panel as if it were his lifeline. The figure lunged at him, its elongated limbs stretching impossibly far, but Daniel was ready. He slammed his fist down on the lever, forcing it to its final position. A deafening explosion rocked the factory, and a blinding light burst from the Phoenix, consuming everything in its path. The figure shrieked in agony, its form dissolving into the light, its hollow eyes locked on Daniel until the very last moment. The whistle of the Phoenix roared one final time, louder than ever, before fading into silence. The factory trembled, its walls cracking, its machinery groaning as if in protest. The oppressive darkness lifted, and for the first time, Daniel could see the room clearly. The Phoenix was gone, its monstrous frame reduced to a pile of smoldering rubble. The shadows had vanished, leaving only faint, charred marks on the floor where they had once writhed. But the factory was still. Too still. Daniel's knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold, rusted floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. The air was quiet now, eerily so, and the faint scent of burning metal lingered. He looked down at the journal in his hands, its pages blank, the once ominous words erased as though they had never existed. He had won, but at what cost? The memories of his parents' faces lingered in his mind, their hollow eyes filled with silent pleas. He had ended the curse, but he knew the factory had taken more than just their lives. It had taken pieces of him, pieces he would never get back. As he stumbled toward the exit, the walls around him groaned one last time, a faint whisper echoing through the empty chamber. "We will wait." And with that, the factory fell silent. The factory stood in eerie silence, its massive, rusted frame now still as a tomb. Daniel stumbled through the darkened corridors, his flashlight reduced to a dim flicker. The oppressive hum that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by a void so profound it seemed to swallow every sound. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that the place was watching him, waiting for his next move. He reached the main doors, their metal surface warped and scarred, as though they had endured centuries of decay in mere moments. Pushing them open took all his remaining strength. The hinges groaned in protest, their metallic wail echoing into the night as Daniel stepped outside. The cold air hit him like a slap, and for the first time, he realized how heavy the factory's atmosphere had been. But the relief was fleeting. Behind him, the factory loomed against the starless sky, its silhouette jagged and monstrous. He could still feel its pull, a faint tug at the edges of his mind, like an unspoken promise that it wasn't truly over. His heart raced as he glanced back at the towering structure, half expecting the Phoenix to emerge from the shadows, roaring to life once more. But the windows remained dark, the machinery silent. The journal in his hands felt heavier now, its leather cover cold to the touch. Daniel hesitated before opening it, dreading what he might find. The pages, once filled with ominous warnings and cryptic messages, were now completely blank, save for one line scrawled in fresh, jagged handwriting: "You can leave, but it won't let you forget." A shiver coursed through him as he snapped the journal shut. The memory of the Phoenix, its monstrous form and soul-piercing whistle, lingered in his mind. He could still see the shadows twisting and writhing, hear the guttural voice of the figure that had taunted him. The factory may have fallen silent, but it had left its mark. As he walked away, the world around him seemed unnaturally still. No wind rustled the trees, no animals stirred in the distance. It was as if the factory had drained the very life from the land surrounding it. Daniel's footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the cracked pavement, each step a reminder that he was alone. Or so he thought. A faint sound stopped him in his tracks. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the mournful whistle of a train. Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned, his eyes scanning the horizon, but there were no tracks, no lights, nothing to suggest a train was anywhere nearby. And yet, the sound grew louder, closer, wrapping around him like an icy fog. The air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He turned back toward the factory, his heart pounding. Its silhouette seemed different now, darker and more foreboding, as if the shadows clung to it like a living thing. The windows that had been empty moments ago now glowed faintly, a sickly, unnatural light that flickered like dying embers. Daniel took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. The whistle sounded again, piercing and haunting, but this time it wasn't distant. It was coming from within the factory, reverberating through the hollow structure like a heartbeat. He wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. As the sound faded, replaced by a chilling silence, Daniel noticed something on the ground near his feet. A small object lay there, glinting faintly in the dim light. He bent down to pick it up, his fingers trembling as they closed around the cold, metallic surface. It was the pocket watch, the same one he had found inside the factory. The watch ticked steadily, its sound impossibly loud in the stillness of the night. But when he turned it over, the engraving on the back had changed. Where his initials had once been, there was now a single word etched deeply into the tarnished metal: soon. Daniel's heart thundered in his chest as he hurled the watch to the ground, its ticking abruptly silenced as it shattered against the pavement. But even as the fragments scattered, the sound of the ticking continued, faint but persistent, echoing in his mind. The factory's glow faded, its silhouette disappearing into the darkness once more. But Daniel knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting, biding its time, its malevolent presence now a part of him. He felt it in the depths of his mind, a shadow that would never leave, a curse he could never escape. As he turned to leave, the faint whistle of the phoenix sounded one last time, low and mournful, like a final warning. The road ahead stretched into the night, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how far he went, the factory would always be there, lurking at the edges of his memory, waiting for the moment he let his guard down. And somewhere deep within the abandoned structure, the phoenix stirred, its engine thrumming softly, its hunger never truly satisfied.